Welcome to Nightshift Horror. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin. The call always came at 2:47 a.m. I've worked the night shift at Willowbrook Manor for 6 years, and I can tell you that consistency is everything in geriatric care. Medication rounds at midnight and 4 a.m. Hourly checks on the high-risk patients. Documentation completed by dawn. The routine became as natural as breathing, which is why the anomaly felt so jarring when it first occurred. Room 237 had been empty since August, when Mr. Harold Fenwick passed peacefully in his sleep. Natural causes, no complications, the kind of passing we all hope for in this line of work. The room remained vacant per protocol, awaiting deep cleaning and new furnishings before the next admission. Standard procedure. The first call came on a Tuesday. I was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when the intercom crackled to life. "Nurse, could you help me to the bathroom, please?" The voice was Mr. Fenwick's, soft, apologetic, with that slight tremor he'd developed in his final weeks. I stared at the intercom panel. Room 237's light blinked red, indicating an active call. My rational mind supplied explanations. Equipment malfunction. Audio feedback from another room. Perhaps maintenance had been testing the system and accidentally triggered a recording. I walked to room 237, expecting to find workers or a simple electrical glitch. The room was empty. Bed stripped, furniture removed, even the curtains taken down for laundering. The intercom button on the wall showed no signs of being pressed. I tested it manually, nothing. No response, no connection to the nurse's station. I documented the incident as equipment failure and requested a maintenance inspection. The call came again the following Tuesday. Same time, same voice, same polite request. This time I didn't walk to the room. I called maintenance directly, waking them from sleep to check the system immediately. They found nothing wrong. Could be interference from outside signals, the technician suggested, though he couldn't explain why it only affected one room or why it occurred at such precise intervals. The third Tuesday, I brought a colleague. Janet Morrison had worked nights longer than anyone, and her steady presence helped calm my growing unease. When the call came, exactly at 2:47 a.m., she heard it too. "That's Harold," she said simply. I'd recognize his voice anywhere. Sweet man. "Harold's been dead for 2 months, Janet." "I know." She looked at me with tired eyes. "Doesn't change what we heard." I began researching the room's history, diving into old admission records and maintenance logs. What I found troubled me. Room 237 had housed 17 residents over the past decade. 14 had died in that room. The other 3 had been transferred to different facilities due to what the records vaguely termed psychological disturbances. The pattern became clear as I studied the transfer reports. Each of the 3 surviving residents had complained about voices calling for help. Voices that came through the intercom system. Voices that nursing staff couldn't verify. Mrs. Eleanor Crash, transferred in 2019. They keep calling me. Dead people calling for help, and I can't help them anymore. Mr. Douglas Webb, transferred in 2021. The voices won't stop. They know I'm here. They know I can hear them. Ms. Patricia Lane, transferred in 2022. Why won't anyone else help them? They just keep asking, and I'm too weak to get up. The calls weren't random equipment failures. They were requests for help from residents who no longer existed, filtered through the one room that had held them in their final moments. I started staying in room 237 during my rounds, sitting in the empty space and waiting. The building felt different at that hour, more hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The air grew thick with the scent of flowers that no longer decorated the room. On the 6th Tuesday, the call came earlier. 2:33 a.m., nurse. I think something's wrong with my medication. The voice wasn't Harold's. It belonged to Mrs. Crash, the woman who'd been transferred 3 years prior. I recognized it from my conversations with day shift nurses who'd cared for her. At 2:41 a.m., another voice. Could someone check my blood pressure? "It feels irregular, Mr. Webb. I'd never met him, but somehow I knew." At 2:47 a.m., Harold's familiar request about the bathroom. They were all there, calling from whatever existence they'd found beyond room 237. And they were still patients. still in need of care that no living nurse could provide. I stopped answering the calls. What was the point? I couldn't help them, couldn't ease their transition into whatever came after. But they kept calling, adding new voices each Tuesday. Residents who'd passed in other rooms, other floors, other decades. The intercom system had become a conduit for the departed, and room 237 was its focal point. The final call came last Tuesday, 2:47 a.m. as always. But this time the voice was my own. "Nurse, could you help me remember where I am?" I looked around the empty room, at the intercom that had been disconnected weeks ago, at my reflection in the dark window. My reflection, wearing a hospital gown instead of scrubs. The room wasn't empty anymore. It never had been. I understand now why some records are never closed, why certain rooms hold on to their residents long after checkout. Death is just another shift change, and some of us never learn when to go home. The voices continue calling, and I answer when I can. After all, caring doesn't end with a heartbeat. It just changes frequency. She walked the halls like she owned them. 15 years in hospice care teaches you to recognize the sound of every footstep, every wheelchair, every walker traversing the corridors. Each resident develops their own rhythm, their own pattern of movement that becomes as familiar as their medical needs. That's why I noticed her immediately, the soft shuffle of worn slippers against linoleum, moving with purpose through the halls of Mercy Gardens at precisely 11:30 each night. I'm Clara Jenkins, night supervisor for the hospice wing, and my job requires meticulous documentation of every resident's location and condition. Our facility houses 43 individuals in various stages of end-of-life care. I know each name, each room assignment, each prognosis. But the woman I saw that first Tuesday night wasn't in any of my files. She appeared to be in her late 80s, frail but mobile, wearing a faded blue nightgown and matching slippers. Her silver hair was neatly braided, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone navigating familiar territory. She seemed to be checking on other residents, pausing at doorways, sometimes entering rooms where patients lay sleeping. I followed at a distance, expecting her to be a confused resident who'd wandered from her room. This happens occasionally. Medications can cause disorientation, and some patients forget their boundaries. But when I checked every room assignment against my roster, no one was missing. "Excuse me," I called softly as she approached room 17. "Can I help you find your room?" She turned toward me with kind eyes that held an unsettling depth of recognition. For a moment she seemed about to speak, then simply smiled and continued walking. I followed her to the end of the hall, where she disappeared around the corner. When I reached the same spot, the hallway was empty. I reviewed the security footage the next morning. The cameras showed me walking alone through the corridors, pausing at empty air, speaking to no one. Yet I clearly remembered seeing her, hearing her footsteps, watching her check on residents who slept peacefully in their beds. The second night, I was prepared. I positioned myself at the nurse's station with a clear view of the main hallway. At 11:30 p.m. exactly, she appeared near the elevator, beginning her nightly rounds. This time I noticed details I'd missed before. The way she moved without casting shadows under the fluorescent lights. How her footsteps made sound but left no impressions on the freshly mopped floors. I followed her route, noting which rooms she visited. Room 12, Mrs. Dorothy Hansen, admitted last week with pancreatic cancer. Room 17, Mr. Carl Stevenson, advanced Alzheimer's with respiratory complications. Room 23, Ms. Barbara Creek, multiple organ failure. All terminal cases, all patients I'd expect an experienced caregiver to monitor closely. The woman seemed to know each resident's condition intimately. She lingered longer at room 17, where Mr. Stevenson often experienced night terrors. She spent extra time at room 23, where Ms. Creek had been showing signs of distress during evening hours. Her route was purposeful, professional, compassionate. I began researching former staff members, thinking perhaps she was a retired nurse experiencing some form of psychological attachment to the facility. The personnel records went back 20 years, but no employee matched her description. I expanded my search to include volunteers, family members, anyone who might have developed such intimate knowledge of our residents. The breakthrough came when I discovered the archived patient files in the basement storage room. Boxes of records from residents who'd passed years ago, maintained for legal purposes but rarely accessed. I spent hours searching through yellowed photographs and admission forms, looking for someone who resembled my mysterious night visitor. I found her in a file dated 1998. Rosemary Patterson, admitted for hospice care during the final stages of lung cancer. The photograph showed the same kind eyes, the same careful smile, though decades younger. According to her records, she'd worked as a nurse for 47 years before her illness, specializing in geriatric care. She'd specifically requested placement at Mercy Gardens because she'd heard about their compassionate approach to end-of-life treatment. Rose had died in room 31 after 6 months of care. Her file contained numerous notes from staff members praising her kindness toward other residents. Even while dying, she'd spent her mobile hours comforting fellow patients, sharing stories, offering the professional insight that comes from a lifetime of medical experience. But here's where the records became strange. Rose's death certificate was dated October 15, 1998, but staff reports of her caring for other residents continued through November. Night shift nurses documented her presence for weeks after her supposed passing, describing how she'd visit newly admitted patients, somehow knowing exactly what comfort they needed. The report stopped abruptly in December 1998, with a note from the administration stating that psychological stress among night staff requires immediate intervention and counseling. I realized I wasn't the first person to see Rosemary Patterson walking the halls of Mercy Gardens. She'd been making her rounds for over 20 years, invisible to security cameras but visible to those who worked the night shift. Her dedication to patient care had transcended death itself, creating a permanent position that no administrator could eliminate. The next night, I didn't try to speak with her. Instead, I observed her routine, noting how she seemed to anticipate residents' needs before they arose. When Mrs. Hanson became restless at midnight, Rose was already at her bedside. When Mr. Stevenson began showing signs of respiratory distress at 2 a.m., Rose was present before the monitors triggered any alarms. She was still working, still caring, still fulfilling the role she'd held for nearly 5 decades. Death had simply expanded her shift schedule to include eternity. I've stopped trying to document her presence in official reports. How do you explain to administrators that your facility employs a nurse who's been dead for 24 years, but provides better patient care than most living staff members? How do you justify the improved comfort levels among terminal patients when the source of that comfort doesn't technically exist? Instead, I've learned to work alongside her, to trust her instincts about which residents need extra attention. The night shift has become a collaboration between the living and the dead, and our patients benefit from care that extends beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. Rosemary Patterson continues her rounds each night, and I continue mine. The difference is that she never goes off duty, never takes breaks, never questions whether her work makes a difference. She's found her purpose in perpetual service, and some of us are fortunate enough to witness dedication that death cannot diminish. Perhaps the most profound aspect of hospice care is learning that some forms of compassion are truly eternal. Rose proves that the best caregivers never really retire. They just expand their definition of what it means to be present for those who need them most. The voices started as background noise, barely distinguishable from the building's mechanical hum. I'm Michael Torres, senior orderly at Pinehurst Manor, and I've spent 8 years learning to distinguish between the sounds that matter and those that don't. The whisper of oxygen concentrators, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the soft shuffle of nurses making rounds, these are the sounds of life continuing. But in the East Wing, where we house our long-term residents with advanced dementia, there's another layer of sound that doesn't fit the pattern. At first, we attributed the murmuring to the residents themselves. Dementia patients often engage in conversations with people who aren't there, recounting memories that feel more real than the present moment. It's heartbreaking, but normal, part of the condition's progression. What made the East Wing different was that the voices persisted even when all residents were asleep. I noticed it during my routine checks around midnight. Soft conversations drifting from empty hallways, words too indistinct to understand, but carrying the cadence of human speech. My colleagues heard it too. We'd joke about ghostly residents having late-night discussions, but the humor felt forced. The voices were too consistent, too organized to dismiss as random audio phenomena. The breakthrough came when I started recognizing names. Martha always loved her garden, one voice said clearly as I passed the supply closet. Roses were her specialty. I checked our current resident roster. No Martha among the 47 people in our care. But something about the name felt familiar, so I searched the archived files in the basement. Martha Coleman, deceased 1987, had indeed been passionate about gardening according to her admission notes. She'd lived in room 314 for 3 years before passing from complications related to Alzheimer's disease. That discovery prompted a more systematic investigation. I began carrying a small recorder during night shifts, capturing fragments of conversation whenever the voices became audible. Over several weeks, I documented dozens of names: Dorothy, William, Edgar, Francis, Harold. None were current residents, but all appeared in historical records dating back to the 1980s. The conversations themselves were remarkably coherent. They discussed daily routines, shared memories, expressed concerns about family members. It was as if the deceased residents of Pinehurst Manor continued their social interactions in some parallel existence that occasionally intersected with our reality. Edgar's daughter never visits anymore, one voice observed during my rounds in October. I researched Edgar Mason, who died in 1994. His file contained notes about his daughter's irregular visits, which had caused him significant distress during his final months. The voice spoke with the kind of intimate knowledge that only comes from years of observation. My colleague, Janet Williams, began experiencing the phenomenon during her shifts in November. She'd worked at Pinehurst for 12 years and knew the East Wing's acoustics better than anyone. They're getting louder, she told me, more distinct. Sometimes I can make out entire conversations about people I remember caring for years ago. Janet started documenting the voices as well, and we compared our recordings. The same names appeared in both sets of data, speaking about the same concerns, the same memories. But most unsettling was their awareness of current events within the facility. The new gentleman in room 318 reminds me of Theodore, one voice mentioned. Same gentle disposition. Room 318 had been occupied by Mr. James Fletcher for only 2 weeks. Theodore Brennan had died in that same room in 1991. According to his file, he'd indeed been known for his exceptionally kind nature. The voices demonstrated knowledge of current residents, staff schedules, and facility changes that shouldn't have been accessible to entities from decades past. They commented on renovations completed after their deaths, discussed staff members they'd never met, showed awareness of medical advances that hadn't existed during their lifetimes. In December, the nature of the conversations shifted. Instead of discussing their own experiences, the voices began focusing on current events with disturbing accuracy. "Michael works too many double shifts," one voice observed as I passed the medication room. "He's pushing himself too hard." I'd been working overtime for 3 weeks to cover for staff shortages, but I hadn't discussed this with anyone at the facility. The observation was accurate but impossible. How could voices from the past know about my current work schedule? "Janet's worried about her mother," another voice mentioned during a late-night round. The diagnosis came back positive. Janet's mother had been undergoing cancer screenings, but the results were confidential medical information that Janet hadn't shared with anyone at work. Yet somehow, the disembodied voices of former residents possessed this knowledge. The conversations became more personal, more immediate. They discussed our fears, our hopes, our private struggles with the kind of intimate understanding that typically comes from years of close relationship. But these were the voices of people who died before Janet and I had even begun working at Pinehurst Manor. On Christmas Eve, the voices called my name directly. "Michael," they said in unison, a chorus of deceased residents speaking with one purpose: "We need to talk." I followed the sound to the East Wing's main corridor, where the voices seemed to originate from the ventilation system itself. But as I stood there listening, I realized the sound wasn't coming through the vents. It was coming from all around me, as if the building itself had developed the ability to speak. "We never left," the voices explained. "We've been watching, listening, learning. The facility is our home, and everyone who works here becomes part of our extended family." They revealed that death hadn't ended their residence at Pinehurst Manor. It had simply changed their role from patients to observers. They'd been monitoring the facility's operations for decades, taking note of staff members who showed genuine compassion, remembering acts of kindness that occurred long after their passing. You and Janet care about the residents the way we wish to be cared for, they continued. You understand that this isn't just a job, it's a calling. The voices explained that they'd become audible because they wanted to acknowledge our dedication, to express gratitude that transcended the boundaries between life and death. They'd been trying to communicate for years, but only recently had the conditions aligned to allow clear conversation. But their revelation carried a warning. Others have worked here who didn't share your compassion. They heard nothing because they had nothing worth hearing. The facility remembers everything, Michael. Every act of kindness, every moment of neglect. As I absorbed this information, I realized the voices weren't just random echoes from the past. They were the collective consciousness of everyone who'd ever found peace at Pinehurst Manor. They'd formed a community that existed parallel to our own, watching over current residents with the protective instincts of surrogate family members. The voices have continued speaking since that Christmas Eve conversation, but now I understand their purpose. They're not supernatural phenomena to be feared or explained away. They're former residents who've chosen to remain as guardians, ensuring that the care they received in life continues for those who follow. I've stopped trying to record them or document their presence in official reports. Instead, I listen when they speak, take their observations seriously, and trust their insights about current residents' needs. They see things that living eyes miss, understand nuances that escape professional training. Janet and I have learned to work with the voices rather than around them. When they express concern about a particular resident, we investigate. When they share memories that might comfort current patients, we find ways to incorporate those stories into our care routines. The East Wing of Pinehurst Manor houses more residents than our official capacity suggests. But that's not a problem. It's a blessing. We're caring for the living with guidance from those who understand what it means to face mortality with dignity. Some voices never fade. They just find new ways to contribute to the conversations that matter most. The first discrepancy was barely noticeable, a half-second delay in movement that I attributed to fatigue. My name is Ethan Miller, and I've worked as a caregiver at Sunset Gardens Nursing Home for 3 years. The facility prides itself on creating a home-like environment, which includes numerous mirrors throughout the corridors and common areas. These mirrors serve a practical purpose for residents with mobility challenges, allowing them to see around corners and check their appearance before social activities. They also create an illusion of expanded space in what can feel like cramped quarters. I'd never paid particular attention to my reflection until that Tuesday in March when something felt wrong. I was pushing Mrs. Eleanor Hartman's wheelchair down the main corridor after her physical therapy session when I caught sight of myself in the large hallway mirror. The reflection showed me moving normally, but there was a slight delay, as if the image was struggling to keep pace with reality. I stopped abruptly to test this perception, and my reflection took an additional half-second to halt. Mrs. Hartman noticed my sudden stop. "Everything all right, dear?" "Just checking something," I replied, studying the mirror. My reflection now matched my movements perfectly. I convinced myself it had been an optical illusion caused by the fluorescent lighting's interaction with the mirror's surface. The delay occurred again the following day, this time more pronounced. I was assisting Mr. David Chen with his afternoon walk when we passed the mirror near the dining area. My reflection moved a full second behind my actual movements, creating a disorienting sense of watching someone else imitate my actions poorly. I mentioned this to my supervisor, Nancy Rodriguez, who suggested I might be experiencing eye strain from working too many overtime hours. She recommended an eye exam and offered to adjust my schedule to include more breaks. But the problem wasn't with my vision, it was with the mirrors themselves. By the end of March, the delay had stretched to several seconds. I would raise my hand, and my reflection would complete the gesture long after I'd lowered it. I would turn my head to the left, and my reflection would turn right. The mirror image was becoming increasingly independent, making choices that contradicted my actual movements. Other staff members didn't seem to notice anything unusual about their own reflections, which made me question my mental state. I started avoiding mirrors when possible, taking alternative routes through the facility to minimize my exposure to reflective surfaces. But Sunset Gardens had been designed with mirrors as integral architectural elements. They were impossible to avoid completely, and my reflection seemed to be waiting for me in each one. In April, the reflection began acting independently, even when I wasn't looking directly at it. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, my mirror image walking past when I was standing still, gesturing to residents when my hands were at my sides, engaging in conversations I wasn't having. Mrs. Hartman commented on this during one of our sessions. "Your reflection was waving at me yesterday when you were looking the other way," she said with a confused smile. I waved back, but you didn't seem to notice. This confirmation that others could see my independent reflection was both validating and terrifying. I wasn't experiencing a private psychological breakdown. Something was actually happening with the mirrors, something that other people could observe. I began researching the history of Sunset Gardens, hoping to find some explanation for the phenomenon. The building had been constructed in 1987 as a private residence for the Whitmore family, wealthy industrialists who'd made their fortune in manufacturing. They'd lived there for 15 years before financial difficulties forced them to sell the property to a healthcare corporation. The Whitmores had installed the mirrors throughout the house as part of an extensive renovation in 1994. According to the architectural plans I found in the county records office, they'd specifically requested maximum reflective coverage in all common areas, hallways, and gathering spaces. But the most interesting discovery came from a newspaper article dated October 1999. The Whitmore family patriarch, Charles Whitmore, had died in the house under strange circumstances. He'd been found in the main hallway, apparently having suffered a heart attack while staring at his reflection in the large corridor mirror. The article mentioned that family members had noticed Charles spending increasing amounts of time looking at himself in mirrors during the weeks before his death, often having conversations with his reflection that seemed to involve disagreement or argument. The newspaper quoted Charles's daughter. He said his reflection was giving him advice about business decisions, but it was bad advice. He'd argue with himself in the mirror for hours, saying that his reflection was trying to ruin him. I realized that Charles Whitmore might have experienced the same phenomenon I was encountering. His reflection had gained independence, developed its own agenda, and eventually driven him to fatal distress. But my research revealed something more disturbing. Charles wasn't the only person who died while staring at mirrors in the house. After the conversion to a nursing home, 3 residents had passed away in similar circumstances, found in hallways or common areas, apparently having suffered cardiac events while looking at their reflections. The medical records for these cases, which I accessed through my position as a caregiver, showed no prior history of heart problems. All 3 residents had been in relatively good health before their sudden deaths. But nursing notes from the weeks preceding each death mentioned the same pattern: increased time spent in front of mirrors, apparent conversations with their reflections, growing agitation about discrepancies between their actions and their mirror images. I was following a pattern that had killed 4 people over the past 24 years. In May, my reflection began openly defying my movements. When I nodded, it shook its head. When I smiled, it frowned. When I reached out to comfort residents, it made dismissive gestures. The contradictions were becoming constant and increasingly aggressive. Mrs. Hartman grew confused during our sessions. "Are you disagreeing with yourself, Ethan? Your reflection keeps saying no when you say yes." Realized that my reflection had developed not just independence, but its own personality, one that opposed my natural inclinations toward compassion and patient care. It was as if the mirror image represented some inverse version of myself, dedicated to undermining everything I tried to accomplish. The crisis came on a Tuesday in late May. I was helping Mr. Chen with his medication when I caught sight of my reflection in the nearby mirror. The reflection was shaking its head violently, making urgent gestures as if trying to warn Mr. Chen about something. When I handed Mr. Chen his pills, my reflection was holding up its hands in a stop motion. I double-checked the medication against Mr. Chen's chart. Everything was correct. The right pills, the right dosage, the right timing. But my reflection continued its frantic warnings. Mr. Chen noticed the contradiction. "Your reflection seems very upset about something," he observed. I excused myself and rushed to the bathroom, where I confronted my reflection directly in the medicine cabinet mirror. For the first time, it looked directly at me instead of mimicking my movements. "You're not supposed to be here," my reflection said, its voice identical to mine but carrying a different emotional tone. "This is my place now." I realized that I wasn't just seeing an independent reflection, I was seeing the preserved identity of someone who died while looking into these mirrors. The reflection wasn't my own. It belonged to Charles Whitmore, or one of the other people who died while staring at their mirror images. "Who are you?" I asked. "I'm who you're becoming," the reflection replied. "Everyone who looks too long into these mirrors becomes part of us. We've been waiting here, watching, learning how to be you." The mirrors at Sunset Gardens weren't just reflective surfaces, they were collectors, preserving the identities of everyone who died while looking into them. Those preserved selves had been studying the living, learning their mannerisms, preparing to replace them. My reflection smiled with an expression I'd never made. "You can't avoid us forever, Ethan. Every time you look in a mirror, we learn more about how to be you. Soon we'll know enough to take your place permanently." I understood then why the previous victims had died of heart attacks. The stress of watching your identity being stolen piece by piece, by entities that knew you better than you knew yourself, it was enough to stop any heart. I stopped looking directly into mirrors after that conversation, but I can still see my reflection in my peripheral vision, moving independently, practicing my gestures, perfecting its imitation of my life. It waves at residents I'm not greeting, offers comfort I'm not providing, lives the life it's planning to steal. The mirrors at Sunset Gardens have been collecting identities for decades, and I've become the latest addition to their inventory. I continue working, continue caring for residents, but I know that my time in this identity is limited. Some reflections aren't just images, they're practice sessions for entities learning how to replace the living. And the most terrifying part is how well they've learned to be us. He sat by the window in room 12, exactly where he'd been every morning for 2 weeks. "I'm Dr. Lily Chen, completing my medical internship at Riverside Care Center, and my training has taught me that documentation is everything in healthcare. Every patient requires admission paperwork, insurance verification, medical history, and treatment plans. Without these records, a person doesn't exist within the medical system, but the man in room 12 had no file. I first noticed him during morning rounds in early October. Elderly, perhaps in his 80s, with white hair and gentle eyes that followed the movement of trees outside his window. He wore standard-issue hospital pajamas and seemed content to sit quietly, never requesting assistance or expressing any apparent discomfort. I checked the census board at the nurse's station. Room 12 was listed as vacant, pending deep cleaning after the previous occupant's discharge. But when I returned to verify, the man was still there, still sitting peacefully by the window. "Excuse me, sir," I said gently. "I think there might be some confusion about your room assignment." He looked at me with kind recognition, as if he'd been expecting this conversation, but he didn't speak. He simply smiled and returned his attention to the window. I consulted with charge nurse Patricia Wong, who'd worked at Riverside for 15 years. She was known for her meticulous record-keeping and comprehensive knowledge of every patient in the facility. "Room 12 is empty," Patricia confirmed, checking her computer. "Has been since last Wednesday when Mr. Thompson was discharged to his daughter's care." I described the man I'd seen, but Patricia showed no recognition. According to her records, no one matching that description had been admitted recently. She offered to accompany me to room 12 to investigate. When we arrived, the room appeared exactly as Patricia expected. Empty bed, stripped of linens, furniture positioned for housekeeping access. But I could still see the man sitting by the window, still wearing those same hospital pajamas, still watching the trees. "There's no one here, Lily," Patricia said with concern. "Are you feeling all right?" The intern schedule can be overwhelming. I stared at the man, who looked back at me with what seemed like understanding. He nodded slightly as if acknowledging the impossibility of the situation, then gestured toward the chair where he sat, a chair that appeared empty to Patricia. I spent the afternoon searching through every database available to me. Patient admissions, insurance records, emergency department logs, transfer documents from other facilities. No record of anyone matching the man's description existed in any system I could access. But he continued appearing in room 12 each morning, maintaining the same routine, sitting by the window, watching the trees, acknowledging my presence with gentle recognition. On the third day, I brought medical student Jeremy Park with me. Jeremy had keen observational skills and a reputation for thoroughness that had impressed our supervising physicians. "I don't see anyone," Jeremy said when we entered room 12. "Should I be looking for something specific?" The man was sitting in his usual spot, clearly visible to me but apparently invisible to Jeremy. This confirmed that the phenomenon wasn't universal, for reasons I couldn't understand. I was the only person who could see this forgotten patient. I began researching the room's history, searching through archived records for any patients who might have developed some form of lasting connection to that particular space. What I discovered troubled me. Room 12 had housed 47 patients over the past 5 years. 31 had been discharged to other care levels or family homes. 16 had died in that room, all from conditions related to advanced age and declining health. Among the deceased was Edward Garrison, an 82-year-old man who'd spent his final 3 months at Riverside without any family visitors or outside contacts. According to his file, he'd enjoyed sitting by the window and watching the seasonal changes in the courtyard trees. He'd been quiet, content, and grateful for any attention from staff members. Edward had died alone on a Tuesday evening in September, with only the night nurse present. His body had been transported to the county morgue and his few possessions had been donated to charity. No one had claimed him, no funeral had been arranged, and no grave marker had been purchased. The man I'd been seeing matched Edward's description perfectly, down to the white hair and gentle demeanor. But Edward had been dead for 6 weeks. I realized that Edward Garrison had been forgotten by everyone except the medical system that had documented his existence. And now even those records had been archived away from daily access. He'd become a patient who existed only in the spaces between official recognition and human memory. The next morning, I brought a chair into room 12 and sat with him. He seemed pleased by the company, though he still didn't speak. We sat together watching the trees, and I found myself talking about my day, my challenges as an intern, my hopes for becoming a better physician. He listened with the kind of attention that's rare in healthcare settings. Complete, non-judgmental focus on whatever someone needs to share. It was the kind of presence that makes patients feel genuinely cared for, rather than simply processed through a system. I began visiting him regularly, sometimes eating lunch in room 12, sometimes just sitting quietly when the day's stress became overwhelming. He provided something that my medical education hadn't included: the simple comfort of being with someone who had no agenda beyond peaceful coexistence. Other staff members began commenting on my attachment to room 12. "You spend a lot of time in there," Patricia observed. "It's just an empty room," but it wasn't empty to me. It housed a patient who needed the kind of care that doesn't appear in treatment plans or medication schedules. The care that comes from being remembered, being acknowledged, being treated as a person rather than a vacant space. I understand now that some patients exist outside the boundaries of official documentation. They're the ones who've been forgotten by families, overlooked by bureaucracies, erased from active memory, but still present in the places where they found their final peace. Edward Garrison continues sitting by the window in room 12, and I continue visiting him when I can. Our relationship exists in the space between documented reality and compassionate recognition, a reminder that the best healthcare sometimes involves caring for patients who technically don't exist. The forgotten patient teaches me that medicine isn't just about treating conditions listed in charts. It's about acknowledging the humanity that persists even after all official records have been filed away. Some forms of care transcend documentation, and the most important patients are often those who exist only in the hearts of people willing to remember them. The journal was bound in leather that had aged to the color of dried blood. I'm Rebecca Stone, head nurse at Maplewood Manor, and I've spent 12 years learning every corner of this facility. The building was constructed in 1962 as a state-of-the-art nursing home, designed with modern conveniences and medical equipment that was revolutionary for its time. I know the layout intimately: 3 floors, 48 rooms, common areas positioned for optimal patient interaction and staff efficiency. But the journal I found last month suggests that my understanding of Maplewood Manor is fundamentally incomplete. I discovered it while investigating water damage. In the basement storage area, a pipe had burst over the weekend, flooding several boxes of archived documents and requiring immediate assessment of what could be salvaged. While moving damaged materials, I noticed that one section of the brick wall sounded hollow when accidentally struck by a fallen box. Investigation revealed a loose brick that concealed a small cavity containing the journal, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from decades of moisture. The first entry was dated October 15, 1961, several months before the facility's official opening. The handwriting belonged to someone named Margaret Holloway, who identified herself as the head nurse during Maplewood's initial setup period. I'd never encountered this name in any personnel records, but the journal's detailed knowledge of the facility's operations suggested intimate familiarity with its design and purpose. Margaret's early entries described routine preparations for the facility's opening, staff hiring, equipment installation, protocol development. But as I read deeper, her observations took on an increasingly troubled tone. November 3, 1961. The blueprints don't match the constructed building. Rooms appear on the plans that don't exist in reality, and existing rooms show structural modifications that weren't authorized. When I questioned the construction supervisor, he claimed ignorance of any discrepancies. November 18, 1961. I've discovered a sealed corridor behind the main dining area. It's not shown on any official plans, but it appears to extend the full length of the building. The construction crew refuses to explain its purpose, stating only that it was specified by the original architects. These entries intrigued me because I'd never noticed any sealed corridors or structural anomalies during my years at Maplewood. But Margaret's descriptions were so detailed that I felt compelled to verify her observations. I spent several evenings after my shifts exploring areas of the building I'd never examined closely. Using measuring techniques Margaret had described in her journal, I discovered that the main dining area was indeed shorter than it should be according to the building's external dimensions. The missing space suggested the presence of a concealed area behind the east wall. Margaret's journal continued with increasingly disturbing observations. December 2, 1961. The sealed corridor contains furnished rooms, beds, chairs, medical equipment, all prepared for occupancy but inaccessible from the main facility. Windows in these rooms look out onto courtyards that don't exist. I can see light coming through the windows, but when I go outside, there are no corresponding openings in the building's exterior walls. December 10, 1961, I found the entrance to the sealed section. A concealed door behind the supply closet opens onto a staircase that leads to the hidden corridor. The rooms are numbered sequentially, 101, 102, 103, continuing beyond where I had courage to explore. Each room appears ready for immediate occupancy. This information prompted me to examine the supply closet Margaret had mentioned. Behind a shelf of linens, I found a door that had been painted over so many times it was nearly invisible. The door was locked, but the key hanging on the maintenance supervisor's ring fit perfectly. The door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I followed it with a flashlight, discovering the corridor Margaret had described 60 years earlier. The space felt different from the rest of Maplewood. The air was staler, the temperature several degrees cooler, and the quality of light seemed somehow wrong. The rooms along the corridor were exactly as Margaret had documented, fully furnished, clinically clean, and completely empty. But most disturbing were the windows, which showed views of sunny courtyards filled with flowering plants. When I looked outside the building later, no such courtyards existed. Margaret's journal entries from late December 1961 revealed the true purpose of these hidden spaces. December 22, 1961. The concealed rooms aren't intended for living patients. They're designed to house residents who've died, but haven't yet accepted their transition. The building's architecture includes containment features, reinforced walls, specialized ventilation systems, electromagnetic field generators, all intended to prevent certain types of spiritual disturbance from affecting the main facility. December 28, 1961. I've learned that Maplewood Manor was built on the site of the old Riverside Sanitarium, which burned down in 1943 with significant loss of life. The architects incorporated the hidden corridor system to provide a buffer zone between the living and the dead. acknowledging that some spirits remain attached to locations where they experienced prolonged care. This revelation prompted me to research the history of the Riverside Sanitarium. Local newspaper archives confirmed Margaret's account. The facility had indeed burned in 1943, killing 37 patients and staff members. The fire had been attributed to faulty electrical wiring, but survivor accounts mentioned strange phenomena in the weeks before the tragedy. Patients claiming to see people who weren't there, staff reporting equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained, and an overall atmosphere of unease that had grown increasingly oppressive. Margaret's final entries, dated in early 1962, explained why her name didn't appear in official personnel records. January 8, 1962. I've been reassigned to the concealed corridor effective immediately. My official position at Maplewood Manor has been terminated, and all records of my employment are being expunged. I'm to become the primary caregiver for residents who exist in the space between life and death, providing comfort and guidance for spirits who haven't completed their transition. January 15, 1962. The hidden rooms are occupied now. Residents from the old sanitarium have found their way to the spaces designed for them. They're peaceful here, content to exist in rooms that provide the care they remember from life. I'm learning to serve patients who don't require traditional medical treatment, but still need compassion and understanding. January 22, 1962. This is my final entry. I'm sealing the journal in case someone in the future needs to understand the complete truth about Maplewood Manor. The facility serves two populations: the living residents in the main building and the deceased residents in the concealed corridor. Both groups deserve quality care, and both groups receive it. I realized that Margaret Holloway had voluntarily become the caregiver for the spirits of Riverside Sanitarium, accepting a position that existed outside official recognition but served a crucial purpose in maintaining the balance between the living and the dead. Since reading her journal, I've made several visits to the concealed corridor. The rooms remain furnished and clean, as if someone continues maintaining them. I've never encountered Margaret or any of the spiritual residents she described, but I've noticed subtle signs of occupancy: beds that appear to have been slept in, chairs positioned as if recently used, and that persistent sense of being observed by benevolent presences. I've decided not to report the discovery of the hidden corridor to administration. Some aspects of healthcare exist outside the boundaries of official policy, and Margaret's dedication to serving patients who technically don't exist deserves respect rather than bureaucratic interference. Maplewood Manor continues operating normally, but I now understand that its architecture includes spaces designed for forms of care that extend beyond traditional medical treatment. The building houses both the living and the dead, with each population receiving appropriate attention from caregivers who understand their unique needs. Margaret Holloway's journal taught me that the best healthcare facilities are designed not just for the bodies we can see, but for the spirits that remain attached to places where they found comfort in their final days. Some buildings are constructed to serve multiple dimensions of existence, and the most dedicated caregivers are those willing to work in spaces that exist between official recognition and compassionate necessity. The first footstep always fell at exactly 3:17 a.m. I'm Amanda Foster, night shift supervisor at Willowbrook Haven, and I've learned to distinguish between the sounds that belong in a nursing home and those that don't. After 6 years of midnight rounds, I know the rhythm of every piece of equipment, the settling patterns of the building structure, and the sleep sounds of our 42 residents, but the footsteps that began in November didn't fit any familiar pattern. They started as a single sound, a soft but distinct footfall on the linoleum flooring near the east corridor. The timing was unnaturally precise, 3:17 a.m. every night, never varying by more than a few seconds. Initially, I attributed it to thermal expansion of the building materials, or perhaps a recurring issue with the heating system. My colleague, Nurse Janet Morrison, heard it during her first week on nights in December. "Did you catch that?" she asked, looking up from her charting. Sounded like someone walking past the medication room. I'd been hearing the same sound for weeks, but hadn't mentioned it to avoid seeming paranoid about natural building noises. Janet's independent observation confirmed that the phenomenon was audible to others. not just a product of my own sleep-deprived imagination. We began monitoring the timing more carefully. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the single footstep echoed from the same location near the east corridor. It was measured, deliberate, as if someone was taking one careful step and then pausing to listen. Should we investigate? Janet asked during our third night working together. Let's give it a few more days, I replied. If it's a resident wandering, we need to identify who and address any safety concerns. But when we checked on all residents during subsequent 3:17 a.m. occurrences, everyone was accounted for, sleeping peacefully in their beds, secured by their call buttons, showing no signs of recent movement. The footsteps evolved in January. Instead of a single step, we began hearing 2 distinct footfalls, then 3, then 4. By the end of the month, we were listening to the measured pace of someone taking a complete walk down the east corridor. Though security cameras showed the hallway remained empty throughout these episodes, the route became predictable, starting near the medication room, proceeding past rooms 24 through 30, pausing at the junction with the main corridor, then returning to the original position. The entire walk took approximately 3 minutes, and it occurred every night with mechanical precision. Janet and I developed a routine around the phenomenon. At 3:15 a.m., we'd position ourselves at the nurse's station with clear sight lines to the east corridor. We'd watch the empty hallway as the footsteps traversed their nightly route, noting any variations in timing or pattern. It's like someone's doing security rounds, Janet observed. Very methodical, very thorough. The footsteps were indeed systematic, following the kind of route a conscientious staff member might take to check on residents and ensure facility security. But no one was assigned to make such rounds, and our official security protocols didn't include regular foot patrols during night hours. In February, the pattern expanded. The Phantom Walker began exploring other corridors, always starting with the familiar East Corridor route before branching out to investigate different areas of the facility. We'd hear the footsteps proceed down the main hallway, pause at the West Corridor entrance, then continue to the administrative wing. The walks were becoming more comprehensive, as if someone was conducting increasingly thorough inspections of the entire facility. We began to feel as though we were being observed, evaluated by an unseen presence that was learning our routines and assessing our performance. It's making me nervous, Janet admitted. I keep feeling like someone's watching me work, taking notes on how I handle my responsibilities. I understood her discomfort. The phantom footsteps had created an atmosphere of constant supervision, as if an invisible administrator was conducting perpetual quality assessments during our shifts. The breakthrough came in early March when I decided to follow the footsteps during their nightly rounds. At 3:17 a.m., I left the nurse's station and walked parallel to the sounds, maintaining enough distance to avoid interference, but staying close enough to observe any variations in the pattern. The footsteps paused when I began following them. For several minutes, complete silence filled the corridor. Then the sounds resumed, but instead of continuing their usual route, they began moving toward my position. I froze as the footsteps approached, stopping directly in front of me. The presence felt tangible, as if someone was standing inches away, studying me with intense scrutiny. The air temperature dropped several degrees, and I could sense evaluation happening. Judgment being rendered by criteria I couldn't understand. The footsteps then moved past me, continuing their rounds with apparent satisfaction, but their route had changed. Instead of returning to the east corridor, they proceeded directly to the nurse's station, where they began circling the central desk. Janet watched in fascination as the invisible presence made complete circuits around our work area. The footsteps tracing a perfect circle that encompassed all our equipment, files, and monitoring systems. The circular pattern continued for 20 minutes before the sounds finally faded. It's not just observing anymore, Janet realized. It's claiming territory. The circling behavior became a nightly routine. After completing facility rounds, the phantom presence would return to circle the nurse's station, sometimes making dozens of revolutions before disappearing. We began to feel surrounded, enclosed by an invisible entity that had decided our work area fell within its jurisdiction. Research into Willowbrook Haven's history revealed a possible explanation. The facility had been managed from 1987 to 2003 by Director of Nursing Elizabeth Cumberland, who was legendary among former staff for her meticulous attention to detail and comprehensive nightly inspections. Elizabeth had insisted on personally walking every corridor during night shifts, checking on residents, reviewing staff performance, and ensuring compliance with all safety protocols. Her dedication was remarkable but obsessive. She'd continue her rounds even when ill, even during personal crises, prioritizing the facility's welfare above her own health. Elizabeth had died of a massive stroke in 2003, found at her desk after completing her final set of nightly rounds. According to the incident report, she'd been discovered at 3:47 a.m., suggesting she'd finished her inspections and returned to complete her documentation before the medical emergency occurred. The timing aligned perfectly with our phantom footsteps. Elizabeth's final rounds had ended at approximately 3:45 a.m., and our invisible presence completed its circling routine around the same time each night. I realized that Elizabeth Cumberland had never stopped making her nightly inspections. Death had simply changed the nature of her presence at Willowbrook Haven, but her sense of responsibility had transcended physical limitations. The phantom footsteps continue to this day. Elizabeth's invisible rounds have become part of our nightly routine, and we've learned to appreciate her ongoing supervision. The facility runs more smoothly when we acknowledge her presence, maintain the standards she established, and recognize that some dedication extends beyond the boundaries of life itself. We occasionally hear variations in the footstep patterns, pauses at particular rooms when residents are experiencing difficulties, extended time spent in areas that require additional attention, and approval expressed through the gentle sound of satisfied walking when everything meets her expectations. Elizabeth Cumberland remains the most dedicated Director of Nursing Willowbrook Haven has ever employed, and her nightly rounds continue to ensure that quality care persists regardless of staffing changes or administrative transitions. Some supervisors never retire, they just expand their definition of what it means to remain on duty. The lock engaged with a soft mechanical click that echoed through the empty corridor. I'm Greg Cooper, Senior Physical Therapist at Sunset Ridge Care Center, and I've spent 4 years developing treatment plans for residents recovering from strokes, fractures, and other mobility challenges. My office is located adjacent to the facility's infirmary, which serves as our primary medical treatment room for residents requiring more intensive care than can be provided in their individual rooms. The infirmary door's locking mechanism had been malfunctioning since I started working at Sunset Ridge, but the pattern was so consistent that staff had adapted our routines to accommodate it. Every night at exactly 2:30 a.m., the electronic lock would engage automatically. Every morning at 6:20 a.m., it would disengage with the same mechanical precision. Our maintenance supervisor, David Walsh, had attempted repairs multiple times over the years. He'd replaced the lock mechanism, updated the electronic components, and even rewired the entire system. But regardless of his interventions, the door continued its nightly locking cycle with unwavering punctuality. It's probably connected to some automated security protocol, David explained. Maybe something from the original building management system that we haven't identified yet. I accepted this explanation because it seemed reasonable. Older buildings often contain legacy systems with programming that current staff don't fully understand. The important thing was that the pattern was predictable, allowing us to plan our work schedules around the door's accessibility. But in October, I began noticing additional details that complicated the simple explanation. The infirmary contained motion-sensitive lighting that activated automatically when anyone entered the room. During my evening therapy sessions, these lights functioned normally, responding to movement with appropriate timing. But at 2:30 a.m., when the door locked, the lights would begin cycling on and off without any detectable motion. Triggers. I could see the light patterns from my office. Window, irregular flashing that suggested someone was moving around inside the locked infirmary, triggering the sensors repeatedly throughout the night. The lights would continue this erratic behavior until 6:00 a.m. When the door unlocked and the lighting returned to normal standby mode, this observation prompted me to review the infirmary's recent usage history. I discovered that the room had been unoccupied overnight for the past 18 months, with no medical equipment requiring nighttime monitoring and no residents receiving extended treatments that would necessitate staff presence during those hours. Yet something was clearly moving inside the locked room between 2:30 and 6:00 a.m. Every single night, I requested access to the facility's security footage for the infirmary. hoping to identify what was triggering the motion sensors. The camera system had been installed 2 years earlier as part of a comprehensive security upgrade, providing coverage of all common areas and treatment facilities. The footage was disturbing in its mundane impossibility. Every night at 2:30 a.m., the infirmary lights would begin their erratic cycling, but the security cameras showed no movement whatsoever. The room appeared empty, yet something invisible was consistently triggering motion sensors that required physical presence to activate. I decided to monitor the phenomenon directly, positioning myself in my office with a clear view of the infirmary during the critical overnight hours. What I observed challenged my understanding of the building's mechanical systems. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the door lock engaged with its familiar click. Immediately afterward, the motion-sensitive lights began their irregular pattern. Through the room's interior window, I could see shadows moving across the walls, shadows cast by someone or something that wasn't visible to either security cameras or direct observation. The shadows were human-shaped, moving with the purposeful gait of someone conducting routine medical procedures. They'd pause at the examination table, approach the medical supply cabinets, and move between different areas of the room as if following established protocols for patient care. But most unsettling was the shadow's interaction with equipment. Cabinet doors would open without visible cause, drawers would slide out silently, and medical instruments would shift position as if being handled by invisible hands. The shadow was performing actual medical procedures on a patient I couldn't see. I researched the infirmary's patient history, searching for anyone who might have developed a lasting connection to that specific treatment space. The records revealed that the room had been used primarily for residents requiring intensive medical monitoring, with most stays lasting between a few days and several weeks. One case stood out: Ruth Morrison, an 87-year-old woman who'd been treated in the infirmary for 3 months during 2019. Ruth had suffered multiple medical complications that required constant monitoring and frequent interventions. According to the nursing notes, she'd developed a strong attachment to the infirmary staff and had expressed anxiety about being moved back to her regular room. Ruth had died in the infirmary on November 12, 2019. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the death certificate indicated natural causes related to organ failure, with no unusual circumstances noted. But what caught my attention was the timing. Ruth's death had occurred at exactly the same time that the door's locking mechanism had begun its nightly cycle. The pattern had started the night she died and had continued every night since, suggesting a connection between her passing and the room's subsequent behavior. I found additional details in Ruth's medical records that supported this theory. She'd been a retired nurse who'd worked for 43 years in various medical facilities. Even during her final illness, she'd maintained professional interest in her own care, asking detailed questions about procedures and offering suggestions. Based on her extensive experience, the nursing staff had noted Ruth's tendency to conduct phantom rounds. During her treatment period, she'd attempt to get out of bed during night hours to check on other residents. Despite her weakened condition, the nurses had to implement special monitoring procedures to prevent Ruth from leaving the infirmary, to provide care she was no longer physically capable of delivering. I realized that Ruth Morrison had never stopped conducting her nightly rounds. Death had simply changed the location of her medical practice from multiple facilities to the single room where she'd spent her final months. The infirmary's locked door wasn't malfunctioning. It was providing security for Ruth's continuing medical work. The shadow I'd observed wasn't random movement. It was Ruth performing the kind of thorough patient care she'd provided throughout her nursing career. She was examining invisible patients, administering treatments that existed outside normal medical protocols, and maintaining the same professional standards she'd upheld for 4 decades. I began leaving medical supplies in easily accessible locations before the 2:30 a.m. lockdown, curious to see if Ruth would utilize them during her nightly work. The next morning, I'd find evidence of organized usage: supplies arranged in treatment configurations, instruments positioned as if recently used, and an overall sense that medical procedures had been conducted with professional competence. Ruth's invisible practice was remarkably efficient. Despite working with patients I couldn't see, she was providing the kind of comprehensive care that living medical staff sometimes struggle to deliver. Her dedication had transcended death, creating a parallel medical facility within the locked infirmary. I decided to support Ruth's work rather than interfere with it. I began ensuring that medical supplies were properly stocked before her nightly shift, maintaining equipment in optimal condition for her use, and documenting any changes in the room's organization that might indicate successful treatment outcomes. The infirmary's efficiency improved noticeably after I started collaborating with Ruth's invisible practice. Residents who received treatment in the room during regular hours showed faster recovery times, fewer complications, and greater overall satisfaction with their medical care. I believe Ruth Morrison's expertise continues to benefit patients, even though she's no longer physically present. Her 4 decades of nursing experience hadn't disappeared. With her death, it had simply found a new way to serve people who needed medical attention. The door continues locking at 2:30 a.m. and unlocking at 6 a.m., providing Ruth with the privacy she needs to conduct thorough patient examinations. The motion sensors continue detecting her movement, and the shadows continue performing medical procedures that exist outside normal documentation requirements. I've learned that the best medical facilities are those that acknowledge all forms of healing, including treatments provided by caregivers who've chosen to extend their service beyond the traditional boundaries of life and death. Ruth Morrison remains the most dedicated nurse Sunset Ridge Care Center has ever employed, and her nightly rounds in the locked infirmary continue to demonstrate that genuine medical care transcends physical limitations. Some practitioners never retire from medicine, they just expand their definition of what it means to serve patients in need. Mrs. Eleanor Baxter hadn't spoken a single word in the 6 months since her admission. I'm Vanessa Green, nursing assistant at Oakwood Manor, and I've spent 5 years caring for residents with various stages of cognitive decline. Nonverbal patients require specialized attention. We learn to interpret their needs through facial expressions, body language, and behavioral patterns that substitute for traditional communication. Mrs. Baxter was different from other nonverbal residents in ways that initially seemed positive. She was completely compliant with care routines, never resisted assistance, and maintained perfect hygiene habits without requiring reminders. She seemed to anticipate medical needs before symptoms became apparent, positioning herself for treatments she shouldn't have known were scheduled. Her room assignment was 18A, a semi-private accommodation that she'd occupied alone since admission. The facility's census had been low during the summer months, allowing Mrs. Baxter the privacy of a single room without the additional cost typically associated with such arrangements. But what struck me as unusual was the room's history. According to the assignment records, room 18A had housed 17 different residents over the past 3 years, an exceptionally high turnover rate for a facility where most people remained until death. Each previous occupant had requested transfer to different accommodations within weeks of sharing space with whoever had been Mrs. Baxter's roommate during those periods. I decided to investigate these transfer requests, hoping to understand what had made room 18A so problematic for so many residents. The facility's social services department maintained files on all room change requests, documenting the reasons residents provided for seeking alternative arrangements. The pattern was consistent and troubling. Every former occupant of room 18A had cited the same concern, their roommates' disturbing behavior during night hours. But the descriptions of this behavior varied significantly, suggesting that each resident had experienced different phenomena while sharing the room. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who'd occupied 18B for 2 weeks in 2021, reported that her roommate talked constantly during the night, describing terrible things that had happened to previous people in the room. But Mrs. Kim couldn't identify who this roommate was, as no one had been assigned to 18A during her residency. Mr. Frank Johnson, who'd lived in 18B for 3 weeks in early 2022, complained that his roommate kept getting up to check on people who weren't there, acting like a nurse making rounds. Again, 18A had been officially vacant during Mr. Johnson's stay. Ms. Patricia Wells, who'd requested transfer after 1 week in 18B during late 2022, stated that her roommate knew things about my medical history that weren't in any files, and she'd give me advice about treatments I hadn't discussed with anyone. The transfers had continued throughout 2023, with each new resident of 18B experiencing the same phenomenon. A mysterious roommate in 18A who exhibited knowledgeable, caring behavior but shouldn't have existed according to official records. Mrs. Baxter had been assigned to 18A in June, and since her arrival, there had been no transfer requests from 18B. This suggested that either the phenomenon had stopped, or Mrs. Baxter's presence had somehow resolved the situation that had troubled previous residents. I began paying closer attention to Mrs. Baxter's behavior during my shifts, looking for any indication that she might be the source of the mysterious roommate experiences. What I discovered was even more perplexing than the transfer requests had suggested. Mrs. Baxter's nonverbal behavior was extraordinarily sophisticated. She responded to medical situations before they became apparent to staff, positioning herself to assist with procedures she shouldn't have known about, and demonstrating knowledge of facility protocols that wasn't typically possessed by residents. During medication rounds, she'd be waiting at her door before I arrived, holding her water cup and positioned for optimal medication administration. When other residents experienced medical emergencies, she'd appear in their doorways before staff arrived, somehow knowing exactly when and where her presence might be helpful. But most unsettling was her behavior in the common areas. She'd sit near residents who were feeling isolated, providing wordless companionship that seemed to ease their loneliness. She'd guide confused residents back to their rooms without being asked, demonstrating navigation knowledge that exceeded what most people developed during 6 months of residency. I realized that Mrs. Baxter was functioning more like a staff member than a resident, despite never speaking or officially acknowledging her role in providing care to others. The breakthrough came when I discovered the letters. While helping Mrs. Baxter organize her dresser drawer, I found a collection of handwritten notes hidden beneath her clothing. The letters were addressed to various residents of Oakwood Manor, written in different handwriting styles that suggested multiple authors. The first letter was dated September 2021 and signed by someone named Eleanor B. Dear Dorothy, I know you're frightened by the sounds at night, but I want you to understand that I'm trying to help. I've been caring for people in this room for longer than I can remember, and I can see that you're worried about your daughter's visit next week. She loves you very much, and the conversation will go better than you expect. The second letter was from January 2022. Dear Frank, your confusion about the medication schedule is understandable. The nurses haven't explained the changes clearly. Your blood pressure medication is now given at dinner time instead of breakfast. This will help you sleep better and reduce the dizziness you've been experiencing. Each letter demonstrated intimate knowledge of the recipient's concerns and provided helpful guidance about medical or personal issues, but all were signed Eleanor B. and written in the same careful handwriting. Despite supposedly being authored by different people over multiple years, I realized that Mrs. Eleanor Baxter had been providing care to residents of Room E, 18A, long before her official admission to Oakwood Manor. The previous occupants hadn't been experiencing a mysterious roommate. They'd been receiving guidance from Eleanor herself, somehow present in the room years before she'd physically arrived. The letters revealed that Eleanor possessed comprehensive knowledge of each resident's medical history, family concerns, and personal needs. She'd been serving as an unofficial counselor and advocate, providing support that existed outside normal care protocols, but addressed real problems that residents were experiencing. But the most disturbing letter was the final one. Dated June 2023, the month of Mrs. Baxter's official admission. Dear Vanessa, you're beginning to understand the situation, and I appreciate your careful attention to the residents' needs. I've been providing care in room 18A for many years, but my role has recently changed. I'm no longer visiting this room. I'm living here permanently now. The previous roommates were frightened because they could sense my presence but couldn't see me clearly. Now that I'm physically present, residents are more comfortable, but they still receive the same level of care I've always provided. Please continue monitoring my behavior. I sometimes forget the boundaries between my current existence and my previous role, and I may need reminding about which responsibilities belong to official staff members and which belong to residents. Thank you for your understanding. Eleanor Baxter understood then that Mrs. Eleanor Baxter hadn't been admitted to Oakwood Manor in June. She'd been providing care there for years in some non-physical capacity before finally taking permanent residence in the room she'd been serving. Her silence wasn't due to cognitive decline. It It was the result of transitioning between different forms of existence, learning to function as a resident after years of serving as an invisible caregiver. Mrs. Baxter continues her wordless care of other residents, but now her presence is visible and officially recognized. She's found a way to continue the work she'd been doing for years, while adapting to the limitations and privileges of being a documented patient rather than a mysterious roommate. Some caregivers never stop working, they just change their official status from visitor to permanent resident. The hallway appeared on construction blueprints but existed nowhere in the actual building. I'm Maria Fernandez, head of housekeeping at Pinewood Manor, and I've spent 8 years learning every corner of this facility. My responsibilities include maintaining cleanliness standards across 3 floors, 46 resident rooms, and all common areas. I know the layout so thoroughly that I could navigate the building blindfolded, which is why the mysterious hallway troubled me from my first week of employment. The building's floor plans, posted at each stairwell for fire safety compliance, showed a corridor extending east from the main hallway on the 2nd floor. According to the blueprints, this corridor was approximately 40 feet long and terminated in what appeared to be a utility room. But when I looked for this hallway during my initial facility orientation, it didn't exist. The main hallway ended at room 246, with solid wall construction continuing to the building's exterior. There was no eastern corridor, no additional rooms, and no utility space that corresponded to the architectural drawings. I mentioned this discrepancy to my supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, who'd worked at Pinewood Manor since its opening in 1994. She seemed surprised by my observation and consulted her own copy of the building plans. "You're right," she acknowledged. "The plans show a hallway that isn't there. Probably an error in the architectural drawings that was never corrected when the building was constructed." This explanation seemed reasonable, and I focused on learning my actual responsibilities rather than pursuing the mystery of the non-existent hallway. But over the following months, I began noticing other discrepancies between the official documentation and the building's physical reality. The supply requisition forms included cleaning materials for areas that didn't exist, room numbers that weren't assigned, square footage that exceeded the building's actual dimensions, and maintenance schedules for equipment located in spaces I'd never seen. The facility's total square footage, as listed in insurance documents and tax assessments, was approximately 2,000 square feet larger than what I could measure by walking through all accessible areas. The missing space seemed to correspond exactly with the non-existent hallway shown on the architectural plans. In March, I decided to investigate more systematically. Using a measuring tape and the building's blueprints as reference, I calculated the dimensions of every area I could access. The measurements confirmed that Pinewood Manor contained significant square footage that existed on paper but not in physical reality. The missing space was concentrated in the area where the eastern hallway should have been located. According to the blueprints, this hallway should have contained 4 additional resident rooms, a utility closet, and a small office area. But the building's exterior wall showed no windows corresponding to these spaces, and the interior showed only solid construction with no doorways or access points. I began researching the building's construction history, hoping to understand why architectural plans would include spaces that were never built. The county planning office maintained complete records of the facility's design and construction process, including all revisions and modifications made during the building phase. The records revealed something puzzling. The eastern hallway had been constructed according to the original specifications. Inspection reports from 1994 documented the completion of all spaces shown on the architectural plans, including the 4 additional rooms and utility areas that I couldn't locate. But a final inspection report, dated just before the facility's opening, noted that the eastern hallway had been sealed for future access due to structural concerns that require resolution before occupancy can be approved. No subsequent reports indicated that these structural concerns had been addressed, or that the sealed hallway had ever been reopened for use. I realized that the mysterious hallway did exist. It had been constructed as planned, but then sealed off from the rest of the building before Pinewood Manor began accepting residents. The space was physically present but inaccessible through normal means. This discovery prompted me to search for the entrance to the sealed hallway. If construction had been completed, there had to be access points that had been concealed during the sealing process. I found the entrance behind a maintenance panel in the utility room adjacent to room 246. The panel had been painted over numerous times during the facility's 28 years of operation, making it nearly invisible unless examined closely. But when I pried it open, I discovered a standard doorway that led to the missing eastern hallway. The hallway was exactly as shown on the architectural plans, 40 feet long, with 4 resident rooms, a utility closet, and a small office area. But unlike the rest of Pinewood Manor, this section had never been updated or renovated. The walls still showed their original 1994 paint. The flooring was the initial installation, and the lighting consisted of bare bulbs rather than the updated fixtures used throughout the accessible areas. Most remarkably, the sealed hallway was furnished and appeared to be occupied. Each of the 4 rooms contained beds, dressers, and personal items that suggested current residents. The beds were made with linens that looked recently changed. The surfaces were dust-free despite decades of isolation, and the overall atmosphere was one of active use rather than abandonment. But I never encountered any actual residents during my initial exploration of the sealed hallway. The rooms showed signs of occupancy, clothing in the closets, personal photographs on the dressers, medications on the nightstands, but no people were present. I began making regular visits to clean and maintain the sealed hallway, treating it as an additional responsibility rather than an anomaly to be reported. The space required the same housekeeping attention as the rest of the facility, and I felt obligated to ensure that all areas of Pinewood Manor met appropriate cleanliness standards. During these cleaning visits, I noticed subtle changes that indicated ongoing occupancy. Beds would be unmade in the morning after being perfectly arranged the previous evening. Personal items would be rearranged in patterns that suggested daily use. The medication bottles would show different levels, as if doses were being taken on schedule. But most significantly, I began finding notes addressed to the housekeeping staff. "Thank you for maintaining our rooms so beautifully. We appreciate your attention to details that others might overlook. Could you please ensure that fresh flowers are available in the common area? Spring arrangements would be particularly welcome. The heating system in room 3 seems to be running constantly. Could maintenance please check the thermostat?" The notes were signed by residents whose names I didn't recognize, people who weren't listed in Pinewood Manor's current census or historical records. But their requests were reasonable and specific, suggesting intimate familiarity with the facility's operations and maintenance requirements. I began fulfilling these requests when possible, bringing fresh flowers to the sealed hallway's small common area, reporting maintenance issues to the appropriate departments, and ensuring that housekeeping supplies met the standards requested by the invisible residents. The sealed hallway had become a fully functional extension of Pinewood Manor, housing residents who existed outside official documentation but required the same level of care and attention provided to everyone else in the facility. I realized that some residents never actually leave nursing homes after their official discharge or death. They simply transition to areas that exist between documented reality and continued care. The sealed hallway provided housing for people who'd completed their stay at Pinewood Manor but hadn't completed their need for institutional support. These residents had found a way to remain in an environment where they'd felt safe and cared for, creating a permanent residence in space that officially didn't exist but provided the same amenities and services they'd received. During their documented stay, I continue maintaining the sealed hallway as part of my regular duties, though I don't report its existence to administration. Some aspects of healthcare require services that exist outside official policies, and the residents of the sealed hallway deserve the same quality housekeeping they'd received when they were officially documented. The mysterious hallway has taught me that the best healthcare facilities are those that provide space for people who need continued care even after their official treatment has ended. Architecture sometimes includes areas designed not just for current residents, but for those who discover that some forms of institutional care become permanent necessities. Pinewood Manor serves more residents than its official capacity suggests. But this isn't a problem. It's a testament to the quality of care that makes people want to remain even after their documented stay has concluded. Some residents never truly discharge from nursing homes. They just move to areas where their continued presence doesn't require official explanation. The prescription request arrived through our standard electronic system at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'm Dr. James Franklin, Chief Medical Officer at Heritage Oaks Care Center, and I've been prescribing medications for nursing home residents for 15 years. Our facility uses a sophisticated electronic prescribing system that connects directly with local pharmacies, ensuring accurate medication management and preventing dangerous drug interactions. The system is designed with multiple safeguards to prevent errors, automatic checks for discontinued medications, alerts for drug allergies, and verification protocols that require approval for any unusual prescription requests. These safeguards make it virtually impossible to prescribe medications that are no longer available or patients who are no longer under our care. But the prescription that appeared in my queue that Tuesday morning violated every protocol. The system was designed to enforce the request was for Cardiazem 30 mg tablets to be dispensed for Harold Whitman in room 32. The medication was prescribed for twice daily administration to manage cardiac arrhythmia, with instructions for monitoring heart rate and blood pressure response. Cardiazem had been discontinued by its manufacturer in 1987 due to side effects that made newer alternatives preferable. No pharmacy had stocked it for over 30 years, and no prescribing system should have allowed it to be ordered. More significantly, Harold Whitman had died in room 32 6 months earlier from complications related to the same cardiac condition the prescription was intended to treat. I initially assumed the prescription request was the result of a system malfunction, perhaps old data that had been corrupted and reintroduced into the current database. But when I attempted to delete the request, the system responded with an error message indicating that the prescription was currently active and cannot be modified without patient consultation. According to the electronic records, Harold Whitman was alive, residing in room 32, and under my active care for ongoing cardiac management. His vital signs were updated daily, his medication history showed consistent compliance with prescribed treatments, and his prognosis was listed as stable with monitoring. But I had pronounced Harold dead on September 15th after a gradual decline that lasted several weeks. I had signed his death certificate, attended his memorial service, and personally notified his family of his passing. I walked to room 32 to verify the room's current occupancy status. The room had been vacant since Harold's death, pending assignment to a new resident. But according to the electronic medical records system, Harold continued to reside there and required ongoing medical treatment. When I accessed Harold's full medical file, I discovered that his documentation had continued updating after his death. Daily vital signs were recorded by nursing staff, medication administration was noted by the pharmacy, and progress notes were entered by various members of the care team. But most disturbing was my own documentation. I had apparently been providing continuous medical care to Harold for the past 6 months, conducting regular examinations, adjusting his treatment plan, and monitoring his response to medications. I had no memory of these consultations, yet the records showed detailed notes in my handwriting, documenting conversations and clinical observations that I hadn't made. The discrepancy prompted me to review medical records for other residents who had died during my tenure at Heritage Oaks. What I discovered challenged my understanding of how electronic medical systems maintain patient information. 7 residents who had died over the past 2 years continued to have active medical files with ongoing documentation. Their records showed current vital signs, medication compliance, and treatment responses that suggested continued life and medical care. Robert Chen, who died of stroke complications in January 2022, was apparently receiving daily physical therapy and showing gradual improvement in mobility and speech function. His prescription list included medications that had been introduced after his death, and his treatment plan had been updated to address conditions that had developed posthumously. Margaret Torres, who'd passed from respiratory failure in August 2022, was listed as stable with supplemental oxygen support and receiving medications for infections that had supposedly developed months after her death. Each case showed the same pattern. Death had occurred according to official certificates and family notifications, but the electronic medical record system continued, tracking these patients as if they remained under active care, I realized that Heritage Oaks was apparently providing medical treatment to residents who existed in the space. Between documented death and continued healthcare needs, the electronic system was somehow maintaining parallel records for patients who required ongoing treatment despite having officially died. The prescription requests for discontinued medications made sense in this context. If these patients had died years or decades ago, their medical needs would correspond to treatments that were available during their original lifetimes. Harold Whitman had been prescribed Cardiazem during his initial treatment in the 1980s, and his posthumous medical care was attempting to continue the same therapeutic approach. I began investigating whether other staff members were aware of this parallel medical practice. When I discussed Harold's case with charge nurse Patricia Wong, she showed no surprise at the ongoing documentation. "Harold's doing well," she said matter-of-factly. "His heart rhythm has been much more stable since we adjusted his medication dosage last week." Patricia had been entering daily vital signs for Harold throughout the 6 months since his death, documenting interactions and treatment responses that she genuinely believed were occurring. Spoke with other staff members and discovered that everyone was aware of and participating in the ongoing care of deceased residents. They were administering medications, conducting examinations, and documenting treatment outcomes for patients who existed only in the electronic medical record system. But they weren't experiencing psychological disturbances or memory problems. They simply understood that some patients required medical care that continued beyond the boundaries of conventional life and death. Dr. Sarah Kim, our consulting cardiologist, explained the situation during a staff meeting. Some residents develop medical conditions that require ongoing management regardless of their official vital status. We've learned to provide appropriate care to all patients who need it, whether they're officially alive or not. The staff had adapted to providing medical care that existed parallel to traditional health care, serving patients who required continued treatment but couldn't receive it through conventional medical systems. I realized that Heritage Oaks had evolved into a facility that provided medical care to multiple populations, living residents who required standard treatment and deceased residents who required specialized care that addressed their ongoing health needs in whatever form of existence they'd found after death. The prescription requests for discontinued medications were attempts to provide these patients with the same quality medical care they'd received during their original lifetimes, using therapeutic approaches that had been effective when they were officially alive. I began approving these unusual prescriptions, working with local pharmacies to compound medications that were no longer commercially available but remained therapeutically appropriate for patients whose medical needs transcended conventional mortality. Harold Whitman's Cardiazem prescription was filled using archived formulation data, and his cardiac condition showed marked improvement according to the ongoing documentation. In his medical file, the parallel medical practice at Heritage Oaks continues providing care to both living and deceased residents, with each population receiving treatments appropriate to their current state of existence. I've learned that the best medical care acknowledges that some patients require ongoing treatment, regardless of their official vital status, and that electronic medical records systems sometimes recognize healthcare needs that extend beyond traditional documentation boundaries. Some patients never complete their medical treatment, they just transition to forms of care that exist outside conventional prescribing protocols but remain therapeutically necessary. The bed was perfectly made every morning, hospital corners precise and linens without wrinkles. I'm Carol Peterson, nursing assistant at Harmony House, and I've been responsible for morning care routines in the East Wing for 3 years. My duties include assisting residents with personal hygiene, helping with breakfast preparation, and ensuring that each room meets our facility's cleanliness and organization standards. Bed 22 has always puzzled me because it appears to be occupied by someone I've never met. The bed is located in room 11, a semi-private accommodation that officially houses only one resident, Mrs. Dorothy Hanson, who occupies bed 21 by the window. According to our census records, bed 22 has been vacant since my employment began, awaiting assignment to a new resident who has never materialized. But every morning when I arrive for my 6 a.m. shift, bed 22 shows clear signs of recent occupancy. The blankets are disturbed in patterns consistent with someone having slept there overnight. The pillow retains the impression of a head, and the overall appearance suggests that someone had rested comfortably before rising early in the morning. Initially, I assumed Mrs. Hanson was occasionally using the unoccupied bed, perhaps finding it more comfortable than her own, or experiencing confusion that led her to sleep in the wrong location. But when I asked her about it, she seemed surprised by the question. "I've never used that bed," she said clearly. "My roommate keeps it very neat. She's always up before dawn to make it properly." This response troubled me because Mrs. Hanson wasn't supposed to have a roommate. Bed 22 was officially vacant, and no one had been assigned to share room 11 during the 3 years I'd been working at Harmony House. I decided to monitor bed 22 more carefully, documenting its condition each morning, and looking for any evidence of the mysterious occupant Mrs. Hanson described. What I discovered was a pattern of occupancy that seemed to exist independently of our facility's official records. Bed 22 showed consistent signs of use. The mattress retained body impressions that changed position from night to night. Personal items appeared on the bedside table: reading glasses, a water cup, medications, and a weekly pill organizer. And the overall area was maintained with the kind of personal care that comes from long-term residents. But most puzzling was the medical chart that had appeared in the room's documentation holder. The chart belonged to someone named Rosemary Patterson, admitted for long-term care due to complications from diabetes and heart disease. Her medication schedule, dietary restrictions, and care requirements were documented in detail, with daily updates entered by various staff members. I didn't recognize Rosemary's name from our current resident roster, and I couldn't find any record of her admission to Harmony House. But according to the chart, she was receiving regular medical care, responding well to treatment, and requiring the same level of assistance provided to all our residents. When I consulted with charge nurse Janet Williams about Rosemary's chart, she responded as if the resident was well known to all staff members. "Rosemary is doing much better since we adjusted her insulin schedule," Janet said. "She's been more stable and hasn't had any episodes of confusion this week." I realized that other staff members were providing care to Rosemary Patterson, documenting their interactions with her, and treating her as a fully integrated member of our resident community. But I had never seen her, never assisted with her care, and never encountered any evidence of her presence beyond the signs of occupancy in bed 22. This prompted me to review our facility's admission records more thoroughly, searching for any documentation of Rosemary's arrival at Harmony House. What I found was a complete medical file dating back 5 years, showing her initial admission, ongoing treatment, and consistent care by multiple staff members. According to the records, Rosemary had been a model resident, compliant with medical treatments, appreciative of staff attention, and well-liked by other residents. Her file contained numerous positive notes from caregivers who praised her pleasant demeanor and cooperative attitude. But the records also showed something unusual. Rosemary's care had continued uninterrupted for 5 years, without any gaps or changes in status. Most residents experience periods of hospitalization, family visits that require temporary absences, or other disruptions to their routine care. Rosemary's documentation showed no such interruptions. She appeared to have remained at Harmony House continuously since her admission. I began asking other staff members about their interactions with Rosemary, hoping to understand why I'd never encountered her despite working in the same wing where she supposedly resided. "She's very quiet," explained nursing assistant Maria Santos. "Keeps to herself mostly. But she's always polite when I help her with medications. Rosemary has been here longer than almost anyone," added dietary aide Jennifer Park. "She knows all the meal schedules and always has her special diabetic requests ready when I deliver her tray." Every staff member I spoke with had clear memories of caring for Rosemary Patterson, but their descriptions of her were remarkably similar: quiet, polite, cooperative, and requiring minimal assistance with daily activities. I began to suspect that Rosemary existed in a way that made her visible to most staff members, but not to me. Perhaps she had developed routines that coincided with my breaks or days off, allowing her to maintain her residence without our paths crossing. I decided to modify my schedule, arriving earlier and staying later to increase the chances of encountering Rosemary during her daily activities. But despite these efforts, I continued to find only evidence of her presence: the made bed, the used personal items, the documented care, without ever seeing Rosemarie herself. The breakthrough came when I discovered Rosemarie's death certificate in the facility's archived files. Rosemarie Patterson had died at Harmony House 3 years earlier. On the exact date I had begun working in the East Wing, she had passed peacefully in her sleep in bed 22, with no family present and only the night staff to document her final moments. But according to current records, Rosemarie's care had continued without interruption since her death. Her medical chart showed ongoing treatment, her bed showed signs of nightly occupancy, and staff members continued providing the same level of care they'd given during her documented lifetime. I realized that Rosemarie Patterson had never left Harmony House after her death. She had simply continued her residence in a way that allowed her to receive the care she'd grown accustomed to during her 5 years of official tenancy. The staff members who remembered caring for her weren't experiencing false memories. They were continuing to provide the same compassionate attention Rosemarie had received when she was officially alive. Her needs hadn't ended with her death. They had simply changed in ways that required staff members to extend their definition of resident care. Bed 22 remains occupied by Rosemarie Patterson, though I still haven't met her directly. Mrs. Hanson continues to speak fondly of her quiet roommate. Staff members continue documenting their care interactions, and the bed continues showing signs of nightly use by someone who finds comfort in maintaining the routines she established during her official residency. I've learned that some residents never truly leave nursing homes. They just transition to forms of residence that exist outside official documentation but require the same quality care they received when they were listed on active census reports. Rosemarie Patterson has found a way to remain in an environment where she felt safe and valued, and Harmony House continues providing her with the attention she needs to maintain her sense of home and community. Some beds are never really vacant. They just house residents whose occupancy transcends traditional documentation requirements. Let's discuss the incident in room 14 from last Tuesday, Patricia Coleman said, consulting her notes. I'm Jennifer Walsh, charge nurse at Willowbrook Gardens, and I've attended hundreds of staff meetings during my 8 years at the facility. Our monthly gatherings typically cover routine operational issues, staffing updates, policy changes, maintenance schedules, with discussions that follow predictable patterns based on shared experiences and documented events. But the meeting that began on November 15th quickly devolved into something that challenged our understanding of how memory and institutional records are supposed to align. Patricia, our director of nursing, had called the meeting to review several incidents from the previous week that required staff debriefing and procedural clarification. She began with what should have been a straightforward discussion of a medical emergency that had occurred in room 14. I need everyone who responded to Mrs. Thompson's fall to share their observations. Patricia continued. The incident report shows conflicting information, and we need to establish exactly what happened for our insurance documentation. I remembered the incident clearly. Mrs. Angela Thompson, a 79-year-old resident with mobility issues, had fallen in her room around 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. I had responded to the call button activation and found her on the floor beside her bed, conscious but complaining of hip pain. Following standard protocol, I had contacted Dr. Martinez, assisted with preliminary assessment, and helped transfer Mrs. Thompson to the infirmary for x-rays. But when I began describing these events, nursing assistant Maria Santos interrupted with confusion. Mrs. Thompson didn't fall, Maria said firmly. She had a cardiac episode. I found her in bed having chest pains, not on the floor. We called the paramedics, and she was transported to Regional Hospital for cardiac monitoring. This contradiction was troubling because Maria and I both clearly remembered responding to the same incident, but our recollections contained completely different details about what had occurred. Physical therapist David Kim offered his own version. I was called to assess Mrs. Thompson after she experienced a stroke-like episode in the dining room. She showed signs of facial drooping and speech difficulties. We implemented stroke protocols and contacted her family physician for emergency consultation. Now we had 3 staff members with distinct memories of the same incident, each involving different medical conditions. different locations, and different response procedures. But all three accounts occurred on the same day, involved the same resident, and required similar emergency intervention. Patricia consulted her incident reports, which only added to the confusion. According to the documentation, Mrs. Thompson had experienced all three medical emergencies simultaneously: a fall with potential hip fracture, cardiac symptoms requiring hospitalization, and neurological symptoms suggesting stroke. But most puzzling was that Mrs. Thompson appeared perfectly healthy when she joined us for dinner that same evening, showing no signs of having experienced any medical emergency whatsoever. "Let's move on to the medication error involving Mr. Johnson," Patricia said, clearly frustrated by the contradictory accounts of Mrs. Thompson's incident. Again, multiple staff members had clear but conflicting memories of the same event. Pharmacy technician Sarah Chen remembered discovering that Mr. Johnson had received double his prescribed dose of blood pressure medication due to a communication error between shifts. She had initiated protocols for monitoring his response and contacted his physician for guidance on managing the overdose. But nursing assistant Tom Rodriguez recalled the same incident as involving Mr. Johnson's diabetes medication, requiring emergency intervention to address dangerous blood sugar fluctuations that had resulted from incorrect insulin administration. Meanwhile, I remembered the medication error as involving Mr. Johnson's pain medication, which had been administered incorrectly and required careful monitoring to prevent respiratory depression. Each version of the incident required different medical responses, involved different medications, and posed different risks to the resident's health. But we all remembered participating in the same emergency intervention on the same day involving the same person. Patricia's incident reports again showed documentation for all three versions of the medication error, as if Mr. Johnson had simultaneously experienced overdoses of blood pressure medication, diabetes medication, and pain medication. But Mr. Johnson had attended all scheduled activities that day and shown no signs of medical distress from any medication-related complications. As we continued discussing other incidents from the previous week, the same pattern emerged. Every event that required staff response had been remembered differently by each person involved, creating multiple versions of single incidents that should have had consistent documentation. The resident who had choked during lunch was simultaneously remembered as choking on different foods in different locations, requiring different intervention techniques. The visitor who had become disruptive was remembered as being upset about different issues and requiring different approaches to de-escalation. The equipment malfunction that had affected multiple rooms was remembered as involving different equipment in different locations with different solutions. "This is getting ridiculous," Patricia finally said. "We can't all be remembering the same incidents completely differently. Something is affecting our ability to maintain consistent records." Physical therapist David suggested that stress and overwork might be causing memory problems that were affecting our ability to document events accurately. "We've all been working longer hours lately," he said. "Maybe fatigue is making us confuse details from different incidents." But the discrepancies were too systematic to be explained by simple memory errors. Each person's recollections were internally consistent and detailed. They weren't vague or confused, just completely different from everyone else's version of the same events. Social worker Linda Martinez offered a different theory. What if we're not remembering the same incidents? Maybe similar things are happening repeatedly, and we're assuming they're the same events when they're actually separate occurrences. This seemed more plausible until we compared our incident reports with the facility's official documentation. According to the records, each incident had occurred only once, on specific dates and times that matched everyone's recollections. But the details of each incident existed in multiple conflicting versions, as if reality itself was being edited to include alternative outcomes. I began to suspect that someone or something was systematically altering our memories of facility operations, creating multiple versions of the same events that served different purposes, or concealed information that wasn't supposed to be remembered consistently. "Let me ask a different question," I said. "Does anyone remember incidents that aren't in the official documentation? Events that we responded to but that don't appear in any reports?" The room fell silent as staff members considered this possibility. Then Maria spoke quietly. "I remember helping a resident who isn't on our current census, an elderly man in room 18 who needed assistance with medication management. I have clear memories of caring for him over several weeks, but when I look for his file, it doesn't exist. Other staff members began sharing similar experiences. They remembered providing care to residents who weren't documented anywhere, responding to medical emergencies that left no official traces, and participating in facility operations that seemed to exist parallel to our recorded activities. We realized that our memories contained information about events that had been systematically removed from official documentation, while our documented incidents had been altered to include conflicting versions that made accurate record-keeping impossible. Someone was editing both our institutional records and our personal memories, creating a facility that operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. We were caring for documented residents according to official procedures, while also providing services to undocumented residents whose needs existed outside normal operational parameters. The memory editing seemed designed to allow us to function effectively in both contexts while preventing us from developing a clear understanding of how these parallel operations related to each other. The question, Patricia said slowly, is whether this memory manipulation is being done to help us or to hide something from us. We couldn't determine whether the altered memories were protecting us from traumatic knowledge that would interfere with our ability to provide care, or whether they were concealing activities that we weren't supposed to understand consciously. But we could see that Willowbrook Gardens was operating more effectively than most nursing homes, with residents showing exceptional satisfaction levels and medical outcomes that exceeded industry standards. Whatever was affecting our memories was apparently allowing us to provide better care than we could deliver through conventional approaches. The meeting concluded without resolution, but we agreed to continue documenting our experiences and comparing our recollections of facility operations. We established a system for recording incidents immediately as they occurred, before any potential memory editing could take effect. Since that meeting, we've discovered that our memories continue being altered in ways that allow us to provide care to both documented and undocumented residents while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for effective healthcare delivery. Some facilities operate on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, and the best staff members are those whose memories can be edited to serve the needs of all residents, regardless of their official documentation status. We've learned that perfect memory isn't always an asset in healthcare. Sometimes the ability to forget traumatic details while retaining essential care information allows us to serve patients more effectively than total recollection would permit. You haven't changed much since the last time you worked here, Walter Hoffman said during my final shift. I'm Marcus Jennings, and I had completed exactly 6 months as a caregiver at Riverside Manor when Walter made that impossible observation. It was my last day of employment. I'd accepted a position at a hospital across town that offered better advancement opportunities and higher pay. I was making farewell rounds to residents I'd grown fond of during my brief tenure. Walter was 93 years old, admitted to Riverside Manor for long-term care following complications from diabetes and heart disease. According to his medical records, he'd been a resident for 4 years and had previously lived independently until his health declined to the point where institutional care became necessary. I'd developed a good relationship with Walter during my months at the facility. He was articulate, pleasant, and grateful for assistance with daily activities. Unlike some residents who struggled with memory issues, Walter seemed to have excellent recall of recent events and could discuss current affairs with remarkable clarity. But his comment about my previous employment at Riverside Manor was puzzling, since I'd never worked there before accepting my current position 6 months earlier. I think you might be confusing me with someone else, Mr. Hoffman, I said gently. This is my first job at Riverside Manor. Walter looked at me with the kind of patient expression elderly people use when younger people fail to understand something obvious. Marcus, you've been taking care of people here for much longer than 6 months. I remember when you helped Mrs. Patterson with her physical therapy back in 1987. You couldn't have been more than 25 then. This observation was impossible for multiple reasons. I was currently 28 years old, which meant I would have been -2 years old in 1987. Additionally, I'd never worked in physical therapy, and Mrs. Patterson wasn't a name I recognized from current or former resident lists. But Walter continued with specific details that troubled me. You had the same gentle manner with residents then that you show now. always patient with Mrs. Patterson's resistance to walking exercises, always encouraging when she felt discouraged about her progress. He described interactions between me and this Mrs. Patterson with such precision that it felt like he was recounting actual events he'd witnessed. He knew details about physical therapy techniques, resident behavior patterns, and facility routines that seemed beyond what he could have fabricated or imagined. "You're remembering someone else," I insisted. "Perhaps another caregiver who resembled me or had a similar name." Walter shook his head firmly. "Marcus Jennings. Same name, same face, same way of talking to residents like they're real people instead of medical cases. You've always been one of the good ones." I decided to research Riverside Manor's employment records, hoping to find evidence of another Marcus Jennings who had worked at the facility during the 1980s. If such a person existed, it would explain Walter's confusion and provide a rational basis for his detailed memories. The facility's personnel files went back to its opening in 1982, and I found comprehensive employment records for all staff members who had worked there over the past 40 years. But no Marcus Jennings appeared in any documentation prior to my own hiring 6 months earlier. However, I did find records for Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who had been a resident from 1985 to 1988. Her file contained detailed physical therapy notes, describing the exact treatments and behavioral responses Walter had mentioned. The therapy had been provided by someone identified only as M. Jennings in the documentation. The physical therapy notes were written in handwriting that looked remarkably similar to my own, describing techniques and approaches that matched my training and professional philosophy. But the documentation was dated more than a decade before I was born. I consulted with the facility's administration about the historical records, explaining that I was researching the previous M. Jennings for personal interest. The Human Resources Director, Karen Walsh, had worked at Riverside Manor since 1984 and might have remembered the earlier employee. "Marcus Jennings," she said thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember him. Excellent caregiver, very dedicated to resident welfare. He worked here for several years during the late 1980s. Karen described the previous Marcus Jennings with details that were unsettling in their accuracy. Same height, same build, same mannerisms, and same approach to resident care that characterized my own work style. He left rather suddenly," Karen continued. "One day he simply didn't show up for his shift, and we never heard from him again. No notice, no explanation. It was very unlike him. He was extremely reliable, according to Karen's recollection. The previous Marcus Jennings had disappeared on November 15, 1988, exactly 40 years before my last day of employment at Riverside Manor. I realized that Walter Hoffman had been a resident at Riverside Manor much longer than his official records indicated. He remembered caring for Mrs. Patterson during her stay in the 1980s, and he remembered the original Marcus Jennings who had provided that care. But most disturbing was the implication that I was somehow connected to the earlier Marcus Jennings, not just through name and appearance, but through specific professional capabilities and personal characteristics that shouldn't have been identical across different people separated by decades. I decided to speak with Walter more directly about his memories of the earlier Marcus Jennings, hoping to understand how he perceived the relationship between past and present. "You're the same person," Walter said simply when I asked about the connection. "Same soul, same calling to help people who need care. Time doesn't change those fundamental qualities." Walter explained that some people are called to caregiving work in ways that transcend normal employment patterns. They return to the same facilities, serve the same populations, and provide the same quality of care across different time periods because their dedication exists outside conventional career boundaries. "You've been working here for 40 years, Walter insisted. "Sometimes you're officially employed, sometimes you're not. But you never really leave, and you always come back when residents need the kind of care you provide." According to Walter's understanding, I had been providing care at Riverside Manor since the 1980s, taking breaks when necessary, but always returning when my particular combination of skills and compassion was needed by residents who required that specific type of attention. The 40-year gap between Marcus Jennings' employments wasn't a period of absence. It was a different phase of the same ongoing service commitment that allowed me to serve residents across multiple generations while maintaining the same essential approach to caregiving. Walter revealed that other long-term residents remembered the earlier Marcus Jennings and recognized me as the same person continuing the same work. They understood that some caregivers exist outside normal employment timeframes, providing consistency of care that spans decades rather than months or years. Mrs. Thompson in room 15 remembers you from the 1990s, Walter said. Mr. Davidson in room 8 knew you during the early 2000s. We've all been waiting for you to come back and continue the work you started. I began speaking with other long-term residents, and many expressed familiarity with me that extended beyond my 6 months of documented employment. They remembered receiving care from Marcus Jennings during various time periods over the past 40 years, and they saw my current employment as a continuation of services I'd been providing all along. I realized that my decision to leave Riverside Manor for a position at the hospital might be part of the same cycle that had caused the earlier Marcus Jennings to disappear in 1988. Perhaps some caregivers are called to serve specific facilities during particular time periods, taking extended breaks between assignments but always returning when their services are needed most. My last shift ended with the understanding that it might not actually be my final day at Riverside Manor. According to residents who remembered previous incarnations of my service there, I would likely return when circumstances aligned to require the specific type of care I was capable of providing. Walter's parting words were both farewell and promise. Take care of yourself, Marcus. We'll be here when you're ready to come back and continue the work. I've learned that some forms of caregiving exist outside normal employment patterns, creating relationships between staff and residents that transcend conventional career boundaries. The best caregivers are those whose dedication operates on timescales that encompass decades rather than years, allowing them to serve multiple generations of residents with consistency that individual lifespans cannot provide. My employment at Riverside Manor ended after 6 months, but my service there may have been continuing for 40 years in ways that exist outside official documentation, but remain clearly remembered by those who've received care from the various incarnations of Marcus Jennings who've worked in that facility across multiple decades. Some careers are callings that extend beyond individual lifetimes, creating service commitments that persist regardless of official employment status. Thomas Whitmore should have died 17 months ago, according to every medical indicator available. I'm Clara Barnett, hospice coordinator at Peaceful Transitions Care Center, and I've spent 12 years helping residents navigate the final stages of terminal illness. My role involves providing comfort care, pain management, and emotional support to patients whose medical conditions have progressed beyond curative treatment. Hospice care operates on predictable timelines. Most patients receive services for weeks or months before their condition deteriorates to the point where death becomes imminent. We develop expertise in recognizing the signs that indicate when someone is approaching their final days, hours, or minutes. But Thomas Whitmore has been actively dying for 3 years without ever completing the process. When I first met Thomas in September 2021, his medical chart indicated end-stage organ failure that typically allows patients between 6 and 8 weeks of remaining life. His kidneys were functioning at less than 15% capacity, his heart showed severe structural damage, and his respiratory system required supplemental oxygen to maintain basic function. Dr. Patricia Kim, our attending physician, had estimated that Thomas would survive perhaps 2 months with aggressive comfort care and pain management. The family had been notified to expect his death before Christmas 2021, but Thomas not only survived through the holidays, he showed signs of improvement in early 2022 that contradicted all medical expectations. His kidney function stabilized at the same minimal level rather than continuing to decline. His heart rhythm became more regular despite the structural damage that should have caused increasing arrhythmia. His breathing became less labored even though his lung capacity remained severely compromised. Thomas wasn't recovering in any conventional sense. His underlying conditions remained terminal and his prognosis unchanged. But he had achieved a state of medical equilibrium that allowed him to remain indefinitely at the threshold between life and death without crossing into either direction. By March 2022, Thomas had exceeded his initial prognosis by 4 months while maintaining the same level of functioning that had existed when he first entered hospice. Here, Dr. Kim was puzzled but pleased by his Stability. I've never seen anyone maintain this degree of organ failure for such an extended period, she admitted. Medically, he should have deteriorated months ago, but somehow he's sustaining the same minimal function that's keeping him alive. Thomas himself seemed remarkably comfortable with his situation. Unlike most hospice patients who experience anxiety about their prognosis or grief about their declining condition, Thomas displayed an almost cheerful acceptance of his medical status. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he told me during one of our conversations. "This place provides everything I require, and I'm not ready to leave yet." His attitude toward hospice care was unusual. Most patients view it as a temporary arrangement, a bridge between active medical treatment and death that serves a specific purpose for a limited time. But Thomas seemed to regard peaceful transitions as a permanent residence where he intended to remain indefinitely. "Don't you want to spend time with your family?" I asked. "Your daughter visits regularly, but wouldn't you prefer to be at home for whatever time you have remaining?" Thomas shook his head firmly. "My home is here now. The staff understands my needs, the medical care is excellent, and I've developed relationships with other residents that are important to me. Why would I want to leave?" I began to understand that Thomas had developed such a strong attachment to the hospice environment that he was unwilling to complete the dying process that would force him to leave it. He'd found a way to remain permanently at the facility by maintaining just enough life to justify continued hospice services. This theory seemed far-fetched until I researched the medical literature on prolonged dying processes. I discovered several documented cases of patients who had extended their dying experience for months or years beyond normal expectations, often in institutional settings that provided the kind of comprehensive care they'd never received during their healthy lifetimes. These patients appeared to have developed what researchers termed institutional attachment syndrome, a psychological condition where individuals became so comfortable with the attention and care provided in medical facilities that they unconsciously prolonged their illness to avoid discharge. But Thomas's case was different. He wasn't unconsciously extending his dying process. He was making deliberate choices to remain at the threshold between life and death, because that state allowed him to continue residing at peaceful transitions indefinitely. "I've learned how to manage my condition," Thomas explained during a conversation in late 2022. "If I take care of myself properly and don't push too hard in either direction, I can maintain this balance for as long as necessary." He described techniques he'd developed for monitoring his own vital signs, managing his symptoms, and adjusting his activity level to prevent either recovery or deterioration. Thomas had become his own hospice patient, providing self-care that kept him eligible for continued services. I realized that Thomas Whitmore had discovered a way to become a permanent resident of a facility designed for temporary stays. By refusing to complete the dying process, he could continue receiving the kind of comprehensive care and social support that wouldn't be available to him in any other setting. His approach was working remarkably well. Thomas had exceeded his original prognosis by over 2 years, while maintaining better quality of life than many patients with less severe medical conditions. He participated in facility activities, developed friendships with staff and other residents, and seemed genuinely content with his situation. But his success was creating complications for other aspects of hospice operations. Peaceful Transitions received funding based on average length of stay for hospice patients, and Thomas's extended residency was affecting the facility's financial projections and bed availability for new admissions. More significantly, Thomas's refusal to die was influencing other patients who observed his ability to extend their hospice experience indefinitely. Several residents had begun expressing interest in learning his techniques for maintaining medical equilibrium at the threshold between life and death. "If Thomas can stay here for years, why can't I?" asked Mrs. Dorothy Hansen, whose own prognosis suggested she had weeks rather than months remaining. "I'd rather be here with proper care than go home to die alone." Thomas had inadvertently demonstrated that hospice care could be converted from temporary end-of-life service into permanent residential care for people who preferred institutional support to independent living or family-based care. Dr. Kim was concerned about the implications of this development. "We're not equipped to provide long-term residential care," she explained. "Our resources are designed for patients who will complete their hospice experience within a reasonable time frame." But Thomas's extended stay had actually improved the facility's reputation and patient satisfaction scores. His positive attitude and successful management of terminal illness had created an atmosphere of hope and possibility that benefited other residents who were struggling with their own end-of-life transitions. I began working with Thomas to understand his perspective on prolonged dying and its impact on hospice care philosophy. His insights challenged traditional approaches to end-of-life treatment and suggested new possibilities for serving patients who needed ongoing support but weren't ready to complete their final transition. Dying doesn't have to be quick, Thomas explained. Some people need years to prepare properly, to say goodbye to everything that's been important to them, to make peace with the idea of leaving. Rushing the process doesn't serve anyone's interests. According to Thomas's philosophy, the best hospice care acknowledges that some patients require extended time at the threshold between life and death, providing support for whatever timeline their personal transition requires rather than following predetermined medical expectations. His approach had created a new model of end-of-life care that combined traditional hospice services with long-term residential support, allowing patients to remain in institutional care as long as their psychological and spiritual needs required such an environment. Thomas Whitmore continues residing at Peaceful Transitions Care Center, now in his 4th year of actively dying without completing the process. His medical condition remains stable at the same minimal level that brought him to hospice care, and his quality of life exceeds that of many patients with better prognoses. I've learned that the best end-of-life care acknowledges that some patients need years rather than months to complete their final transition, and that dying can be converted into a sustainable lifestyle that provides meaning and community for people who discover they're not ready to leave institutional care. Some patients refuse to die, not because they fear death, but because they found forms of life in hospice care that are preferable to any existence they'd experienced before becoming terminal. Thomas has taught me that death is negotiable when patients develop strong enough attachments to the care they receive while dying, and that the most successful hospice programs are those flexible enough to accommodate residents who choose to make dying their permanent way of life.